They told you the system rewards effort. Every school assembly, every motivational poster, every commencement speech. It all drilled the same promise into your bones. Work hard, play by the rules, and you'll rise as high as your talent can take you. And for a while you believed it. You stayed late. You took the extra certification. You said yes to the project no one else wanted. You did everything you were supposed to do. Then you looked at your bank account. Then you looked at your calendar. Then you looked at the people around you. The ones who started 2 steps ahead, who never seemed to break a sweat, who somehow always landed on their feet, and the math stopped adding up. This is the moment the promise cracks open. Because the evidence, when you actually trace the numbers, tells a different story. The Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the most comprehensive wealth data in the country, shows something that cuts straight through the meritocracy narrative. Between 1989 and 2022, the bottom 50% of American households saw their inflation-adjusted wealth grow by exactly $0 per year, once you account for population growth. 0. Meanwhile, the top 1% added nearly $30 trillion in new wealth over the same period. Now let that sit. You weren't standing still. You weren't lazy. You were running on a treadmill that the people who designed it never intended you to leave. When economists trace intergenerational earnings elasticity, that's the technical term for how much your parents' income predicts your own. The data from the Census Bureau shows the United States ranks near the bottom among developed nations. A child born in the bottom income quintile here has about a 7.5% chance of reaching the top quintile as an adult. In Denmark, that same number is nearly 12%. In Canada, it's 13.5%. The land of opportunity is, by this measure, one of the most rigid class societies in the industrialized world. But that's a dry statistic. Let me put it in terms that land differently. Imagine 2 babies born on the same day in the same hospital. One is born into the top 1%. The other is born into the bottom 20%. By the time they are both 30 years old, the first child will have, on average, inherited over $400,000. Not earned, not worked for, just transferred. The second child will have inherited roughly $3,500, and that's before you adjust for the fact that most of what they receive comes in the form of funeral expenses and a used car. You are not competing on a level field. You are competing on a field that was graded, seeded, and irrigated before you were born. Here's what changes everything. The mechanism that locks you out is not one single wall. It's a series of gates, each designed to filter by the exact criteria that correlate with starting wealth. The education system rewards the vocabulary and test-taking strategies that private tutors and stable homes provide. The housing market rewards the down payments that only parents and grandparents can offer. The tax code rewards the capital gains and carried interest that only existing capital generates. Every gate looks neutral on paper because the rule is the same for everyone. But the rule was written by people who had already passed through. If you've ever worked a 60-hour week and still watched the numbers not add up, the mortgage that doesn't shrink, the credit card that doesn't clear, the retirement account that doesn't grow, you know the quiet anger that comes when the promise clashes with the paycheck. And the hardest part is the silence. Because the culture tells you that speaking this out loud makes you a complainer. The culture tells you that admitting the system is rigged is the same as making an excuse. And the culture is wrong. The culture is repeating a narrative that serves the people who designed the gates. So let me ask you something directly. Why do the same families stay wealthy across generations? Not the famous dynasties, the ones you've never heard of, the ones that never appear on a Forbes list, the ones that simply own blocks of real estate, shares of index funds, and stakes in private companies that never go public. Why does wealth cluster in the same last names, decade after decade? If the game were truly meritocratic, you would see constant churn. You would see new faces at the top every generation. But what the data shows is a rotating cast of the same surnames, with an occasional newcomer let in through the front door to prove the system works. Thomas Piketty's research on capital returns is the key that unlocks this puzzle. He showed that when the rate of return on capital, that is, what money makes by just sitting there, outpaces the rate of economic growth, what labor produces by being worked, then wealth concentrates automatically. It doesn't require greed. It doesn't require conspiracy. It just requires the math to work the way it always has. If your money grows at 7% per year and the economy grows at 3%, then over a 40-year working life, the investor starts with $10 and the worker starts with $0. At the end, the investor has $150 and the worker has, proportionally, less than when they began. This is not a theory. This is an accounting identity. It has held for every capitalist economy since the Industrial Revolution, with only 2 periods of interruption: the aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II, when war destroyed capital and government policy deliberately compressed inequality. But here's the part that changes everything. Most people never hear this because the institutions that could teach it, the schools, the media, the financial advice industry, have no incentive to reveal it. Every personal finance book, every financial literacy program, every seminar on wealth building assumes that the game is fair and the rules are the same. They teach you how to play, as if you already had the starting hand. They never tell you that the richest players started with a different deck. Now watch what happens when you layer in the psychological research. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's study on stereotype threat, published in Science in 1995, showed that when highly capable black college students were told a test measured intellectual ability, their scores dropped by the equivalent of 7 percentage points compared with a control group who were told the same test was a problem-solving exercise and not diagnostic of ability. The threat of confirming a negative stereotype, even one they didn't believe, consumed cognitive bandwidth that otherwise would have gone to the task. The stereotype threat finding reveals another layer of the stacked deck. It's not just the money. It's the mental energy drained before you even start. If you want to keep seeing these hidden mechanisms laid bare, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what we uncover next. Drop a comment. What's an attentional tax you've paid that you never even had a name for until now? You can apply this to any group that carries a stereotype about competence. Women in math, older workers in tech, first-generation college students in elite universities. The system doesn't just stack financial odds against you. It stacks attentional odds against you. It forces you to fight ghosts that the children of wealth never even see. And then there is the structural violence of time. The poor do not have enough of it. A single mother working 2 jobs does not have the same ability to network, to research career moves, to negotiate salary, or to absorb the risk of quitting a bad job and looking for a better one. That's not a character flaw. That's a time budget that is structurally constrained by the fact that survival eats every hour. Edward Wolff's research on wealth mobility, using the panel study of income dynamics, shows that even when you control for education, occupation, and hours worked, The wealth gap between white and black households barely narrows over a 10-year window. The mechanism is not effort. The mechanism is inheritance, gift transfers, home ownership subsidies, and the compounding effect of past discrimination. The system is path-dependent. Where you started determines where you can go, even when you run as fast as you can. But before we go deeper, ask yourself how many times you've heard the same advice from people who have never actually done what they're telling you to do. The personal finance guru who made his money selling books, not investing. The entrepreneur who sold a course on how to start a business, not a business that actually generated revenue. The career coach who never held a job in the industry they now advise. That's the first sign of the game. When the people selling the map have never walked the road, the map is a product, not a guide. Stick with me, because what comes next is the part they burned every copy of. Let's talk about the specific mechanism that makes upward mobility a mirage for most people. It is called the wealth-to-income ratio, and it is the single most important number you have never been taught. Piketty's data shows that in the developed world, the ratio of private wealth to national income has risen from around 2 to 1 in the 1950s to around 6 to 1 today. That means that the total stock of accumulated assets is now 6 times larger than the annual flow of income produced by labor. Capital has been accumulating faster than people have been earning. Now, what does that mean for a person trying to climb? It means that the return on what you own matters more than what you earn. And if you own nothing, you are perpetually swimming against a current that only gets stronger. Each year, the capital stock grows faster than the wage pool. Each year, the people who already have assets see their wealth increase by simply owning things, while the people who depend on their paycheck see their share of the total shrink. Consider the housing market. In 1960, the median home price in the United States was about 2.5 times the median household income. By 2023, it had risen to nearly 6 times median household income. That is not a natural fluctuation. That is a structural shift driven by the fact that wealth is being poured into real estate as a store of value, bidding up prices beyond what wages can support. The same house that a single earner could afford in 1960 now requires 2 earners, 2 decades of saving, and a down payment that may need to come from parents. If you do not have parents with that down payment, you are locked out of the primary mechanism of middle-class wealth building. Home equity is the single largest source of wealth for the median American household. And the door to that mechanism is not effort. It is a previous generation's accumulated capital. Now stack the next layer, the tax code. The United States taxes income from labor at a higher rate than income from capital. The top marginal tax rate on wages has historically been significantly higher than the rate on long-term capital gains and qualified dividends. This is not a bug. This is the explicit design of a tax system that treats active work as a less preferred source of revenue than passive ownership. The theory is that taxing capital gains at a lower rate incentivizes investment. The effect is that someone earning $100,000 in salary pays a higher effective tax rate than someone earning $100,000 in stock market returns. The same amount of money produced by the same economy, taxed differently based on whether you earned it with your hands or with your portfolio. And here is where the cascade becomes undeniable. The people who benefit from the lower capital gains rate are overwhelmingly the people who already have capital. The top 10% of households own nearly 90% of all stocks and mutual funds. So a tax policy that favors capital income is by design a policy that favors the people who already have wealth. Every time you hear a politician talk about cutting the capital gains rate to stimulate the economy, you are hearing the language of a mechanism that transfers wealth upward. If you have ever wondered why the stock market sets new records while wages barely move, this is the answer. The market is not the economy. The market is the capitalization of capital. It reflects the value of assets, not the value of labor. And in a period when capital is growing faster than output, the market will always outrun the paycheck. This is where the pattern becomes undeniable. You're seeing the blueprint now. I want you to take a breath and let this land, because what comes next is the part they burned every copy of. The part that explains not just how the system works, but why it cannot allow you to succeed, no matter what you do. The mechanism is not just about money. It is about attention, opportunity, and access. It is about the fact that the same networks that control capital also control the institutions that could distribute it more evenly. Universities, for example, are ostensibly meritocratic gateways. But a study by Chetty, Friedman, Saez, Turner, and Yagan, using de-identified tax records covering 30 million college students, found that children from families in the top 1% are 77 times more likely to attend an elite university than children from families in the bottom 20%. And that gap persists even when you control for test scores and grades. The admissions process is not just about ability. It is about legacy preferences, donor recommendations, extracurricular signals that cost money, and the kind of essay coaching that costs $1,000 an hour. The elite university is not an escalator for the talented poor. It is a validation center for the already wealthy. And when you graduate, the same dynamic continues. The professional networks that lead to high-paying jobs are built through unpaid internships, family connections, and social clubs that have membership fees exceeding the rent of most Americans. The data shows that over 60% of jobs are found through personal connections. If your personal connections are limited to people in the same economic position as you are not networking. You are standing in a room full of people who also cannot open the door. Now let's talk about the most uncomfortable part of this entire cascade. The people who benefit from this system are not evil. Most of them genuinely believe they earned what they have. And that belief is not just self-serving. It is psychologically necessary. Because if you have been told your entire life that the game is fair and you are winning, then your brain must construct a narrative that justifies your position. That narrative is called meritocracy, and it is the most effective ideological weapon the system has ever produced. Social dominance orientation, a concept from political psychology, describes the degree to which individuals prefer hierarchy over equality. The research by Sedanius and Prato shows that people with high social dominance orientation are more than twice as likely to oppose redistributive policies. But here is what is interesting. That orientation is not randomly distributed. It is higher among people who benefit from hierarchy. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to believe that the system is fair, because the alternative is too psychologically costly. The wealthy cannot afford to see the truth, because the truth would make their success feel illegitimate. So they defend the system with a fervor that matches their investment in it. They fund think tanks that produce studies showing that inequality is natural. They fund political campaigns that cut taxes on capital. They fund media narratives that blame the poor for their poverty. And they do all of this while genuinely believing they are defending merit. But notice the pattern. The wealthier someone is, the more psychologically invested they become in believing the system is fair, because the alternative costs them their sense of earned success. That is not malice. That is human psychology protecting itself. And once you see that mechanism, you cannot unsee it. So if you want to keep watching these layers peel back, if you want to understand not just the economics, but the psychology of why the game stays rigged, subscribe and stay in the loop. And in the comments, drop the word dominance if you have ever watched someone defend a rigged system while genuinely believing they earned their place. But perhaps the most insidious mechanism is the one that operates inside your own head. The concept of learned helplessness, first studied by Martin Seligman in the 1960s, shows that when organisms are repeatedly exposed to uncontrollable negative outcomes, they stop trying to escape, even when escape becomes possible. The dog that receives shocks it cannot avoid eventually lies down and accepts the pain. And humans do the same thing with economic mobility. After enough failed attempts, after enough rejection letters, after enough years of watching colleagues get promoted through connections rather than competence, the brain does not just give up. It rewires itself to believe that effort is futile. That rewiring is not a character defect. It is a survival mechanism. The brain conserves energy by abandoning goals that seem unreachable. And the system actively encourages this abandonment by making the path invisible. It is not that you cannot climb. It is that the ladder is hidden behind a wall that only the initiated can see. But here is the hidden cost that nobody tracks. The learned helplessness does not just stop you from trying to climb. It stops you from seeing the climb as legitimate in the first place. You stop blaming the system. You start blaming yourself. And that self-blame is the most efficient transfer mechanism of all, because it costs the system nothing and costs you everything. Consider what happens when you internalize the failure. You stop asking for raises because you assume you do not deserve them. You stop applying for promotions because you assume you will not get them. You stop investing because you assume you will never have enough to matter. Each decision is rational in isolation, but in aggregate, they produce a lifetime of underaccumulation that perfectly serves the people who already have capital. The system does not need to exclude you by force. It can exclude you by convincing you to exclude yourself. Now let me show you the data that makes this visible. The Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances tracks not just wealth, but expectations. When respondents are asked whether they expect their financial situation to improve over the next 5 years, the answers break cleanly along wealth lines. The top 10% overwhelmingly say yes. The bottom 50% overwhelmingly say no. And here is the cruel detail. The bottom 50% are correct. Their pessimism is not a mood disorder. It is a prediction based on accurate observation of the available evidence. The only people who are wrong are the optimists in the top 10%, and they are wrong in a direction that protects their position. This is the quiet violence of a rigged system. It forces you to choose between delusion and despair. If you believe the promise, you set yourself up for disappointment. If you see the truth, you lose the motivation to keep fighting. There is no space in the middle where you can both see the mechanism and keep moving forward, unless you build that space yourself. And that is exactly what the most interesting people in the data do. There is a small subset of individuals in the panel study of income dynamics who break the pattern. They are born into the bottom quintile and reach the top quintile within their working lifetime. When researchers study them, they find a common trait that has nothing to do with intelligence, education, or hours worked. They find something called strategic disengagement, the ability to stop playing the game as defined and start playing a different game altogether. These individuals did not work harder. They did not get luckier. They saw the gate and walked around it. They realized that the rules were written by people who started with advantages, so they stopped trying to beat the rules and started trying to change which rules applied to them. They switched industries. They moved to different cities. They started businesses that served customers the existing system ignored. They did not climb the ladder. They built a different ladder. The mechanism that traps most people is not just financial. It is psychological and structural. The tax code, the housing market, the education system, the inheritance network. These are the visible walls. But the invisible wall is the belief that the existing path is the only path. And that belief is the one thing you can actually dismantle. You cannot change the fact that capital grows faster than labor. You cannot change the fact that your parents' wealth predicts your own. You cannot change the fact that the admissions office favors legacy applicants and the hiring manager favors internal referrals. But you can change the question you ask yourself. Instead of asking how to climb a ladder that was designed to exclude you, you can ask what game you would design if you had to start from scratch. This is not a platitude. This is a strategy that is supported by the data. The entrepreneurs who break the wealth ceiling are not the ones who worked the hardest. They are the ones who identified a structural inefficiency in the existing system and exploited it. They looked at the same tax code, the same housing market, the same inheritance rules, and they asked, where is the gap between what the rules pretend to do and what they actually do? And then they moved into that gap. Consider the carried interest loophole. It allows private equity and hedge fund managers to treat a large portion of their income as capital gains rather than ordinary income, reducing their tax rate by 15 to 20 percentage points. This loophole was not created by accident. It was written into the tax code by lobbyists who represented the firms that benefit from it. Most Americans do not even know it exists, but the people who use it do not complain about the system. They exploit it. Now, I am not telling you to become a private equity manager. That door is as closed to you as the others if you do not have the right connections. But I am telling you that the same principle applies at every level. There are tax advantages for homeowners that renters cannot access. There are retirement account rules that favor people with steady high incomes. There are business deductions that favor people who can afford to start a business. The system is full of hidden doors, and the people who designed them did not design them for you. But that does not mean you cannot find your own. The first step is to stop measuring yourself by the metrics the system gives you. Stop comparing your salary to your neighbors. Stop checking how much you have saved relative to the retirement calculator. Stop letting the credit score define your financial self-worth. These metrics are not neutral. They were created by the same institutions that benefit from your anxiety. The second step is to build what the economists call a low-correlation portfolio of income streams. Do not put all your labor into one employer. Do not put all your savings into one asset class. Do not put all your identity into one career. The people who are most vulnerable to the system are the people who have concentrated their risk. One job loss, one medical emergency, one market downturn, and they are pushed out of the middle class entirely. The third step is the hardest, and it is the one that the data suggests matters most. You must find a community of people who see the same truth you see. The research on social contagion shows that beliefs and behaviors spread through networks with surprising speed. If you are surrounded by people who still believe the meritocracy promise, their optimism will infect you, and your disappointment will be compounded by isolation. But if you find even 2 or 3 people who have seen the mechanism and chosen to act differently, your ability to sustain strategic disengagement rises dramatically. This is not about conspiracy. This is about network effects. The people at the top have always had networks that reinforce their worldview. They go to the same schools, join the same clubs, attend the same conferences, invest in the same deals. They are constantly validating each other's belief in the system. You need the same thing, but with a different belief. So here is where we land. You came here because the promise cracked open. You stayed because the evidence piled up. And now you are at the point where most people stop. They see the truth. They feel the anger. And then they go back to their lives because the alternative is too exhausting. They let the mechanism win by accepting it. But you have a choice. Not the choice to beat the system on its own terms. That is a trap. But the choice to see the system clearly and then decide what to do with that clarity. You can stay inside the game and play it with the knowledge that the rules were not made for you, which at least lets you stop blaming yourself. Or you can step outside the game and build a different one, even if it starts smaller and slower and less certain. The people who break the pattern do not have a secret formula. They have a different relationship to the facts. They do not ask whether the system is fair. They ask whether the system is predictable. And because it is predictable, it is exploitable. You have seen the blueprint now. The gates, the tax code, the inheritance pipeline, the psychological rewiring, the network effects. You know why the same families stay wealthy and why the promise never matched the reality. The question is not whether you can beat the house. The house is designed to win on every hand. The question is whether you can recognize that the house is the only game in town, only if you believe it is. Stop looking for the door they told you exists. Start looking for the door that actually opens. It is not marked. There is no sign. But it is there, because every system has a blind spot. And the blind spot is always the assumption that people will keep trying to play the game they were given, rather than building one of their own. The mechanism of self-exclusion is the most elegant part of the entire architecture, because it requires no enforcement, no police, no laws, no explicit discrimination, just a set of beliefs that, once internalized, become the walls you cannot see. The system does not need to keep you out when you keep yourself out. But there is a counterforce that the research also documents. It is called critical consciousness, a term developed by the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. It describes the moment when a person shifts from blaming themselves for their position to understanding the structural forces that produced it. And that shift, measured across dozens of studies in sociology and psychology, is correlated with higher political engagement, higher community participation, and paradoxically, higher individual economic initiative. The people who see the mechanism do not necessarily become more successful in the traditional sense, but they become more strategic. They stop wasting energy on paths that are structurally blocked. They start looking for openings that the official narrative does not acknowledge. They stop measuring themselves against an ideal that assumes equal starting conditions. This is the gap that the system fears most. Not revolution, not protest, but the quiet withdrawal of belief. When enough people stop believing the meritocracy narrative, the narrative loses its power to discipline behavior. The worker who no longer believes that hard work guarantees advancement does not work less hard out of laziness. They work less hard out of accuracy. They allocate their effort to things that actually produce results, not to rituals that signal loyalty to a system that will not reward them. And that reallocation is the beginning of a different kind of economy. One where labor is not exploited by the promise of future reward, but compensated fairly in the present. One where capital does not dictate the terms of survival because enough people have decided to build outside its framework. And that reallocation, that quiet, accurate withdrawal of belief, is the most disruptive force a rigged system can face. If you are ready to stop measuring yourself against a narrative that was never designed for you, subscribe to keep uncovering the mechanisms that actually shape your life. Drop accuracy over loyalty in the comments if you have already started reallocating your own effort. The rough part is that this shift does not happen overnight, and it does not happen alone. The research on collective action shows that sustained resistance to structural inequality requires dense social networks, shared identity, and repeated interaction. The isolated individual who sees the truth and acts on it is at high risk of burnout. The individual who sees the truth and finds 3 others who have seen it is statistically far more likely to build something that lasts. That is why the most important infrastructure you can build is not a budget or a savings plan or a side hustle. It is a community of people who have stopped apologizing for seeing the mechanism. It is a network of people who can say to each other, without shame, that the game was rigged from the start, and that the only meaningful response is to design a different game. The Federal Reserve data does not show this because it cannot. But the oral histories of economic mobility, the stories that researchers collect in interviews, not spreadsheets, reveal a consistent pattern. The people who break out of the bottom quintile almost always mention a single person who showed them an alternative path. A teacher who gave them a book that changed their framework. A mentor who explained how the tax code actually worked. A friend who introduced them to a different industry. The mechanism of escape is not a formula. It is a relationship. And that relationship is what the system does not want you to have. Because a relationship that reveals the blueprint is a relationship that destroys the illusion. And the illusion is the most valuable thing the system produces. It is worth more than any tax cut or deregulation, because it keeps the machine running without fuel. The belief that you can make it if you try is the energy that powers the entire apparatus. Without it, the engine stalls. You can feel the stall beginning in the data. The percentage of young Americans who believe the American dream is alive has dropped by nearly 30 percentage points since the 1990s. The percentage who believe that hard work guarantees success has dropped by a similar margin. The confidence in major institutions, government, media, finance, education, is at historic lows. The machine is still running, but the fuel is running out. And that is where you come in. Not as a revolutionary, not as a protester, but as someone who has seen the blueprint and decided to act on it. The mechanism does not require you to overthrow anything. It requires you to stop participating in the parts that hurt you and start building the parts that help you. It requires you to see the gates clearly enough to walk around them. The housing market is rigged. The tax code is rigged. The education system is rigged. The inheritance pipeline is rigged. The psychological wiring is rigged. But the one thing that is not rigged is your ability to see all of this clearly and then decide, with full awareness, what to do next. The people who always knew the score are not the ones who found a secret shortcut. They are the ones who stopped asking for permission to play a different game. And that is the only move that cannot be gamed by the system. Because the system can only control the people who agree to play by its rules. If you have ever worked a 60-hour week and still watched the numbers not add up, you already know what I am telling you is true. The question is not whether the system is fair. The question is whether you are ready to stop asking for fairness from a machine that was not designed to deliver it. The evidence is in. The mechanism is visible. The only variable left is what you do with that knowledge. And the data shows that the people who break the pattern are not the ones who found a better path inside the existing game. They are the ones who stopped playing that game entirely and built something new in the space the system forgot to guard. The rough part of building something new is that you will not know whether it is working. The old game gives you scoreboards. The new game just gives you a morning where you wake up and realize the anger is quieter. The mortgage did not vanish. The boss did not change. The economy did not reform. But your relationship to all of it shifted, and that shift is the only wealth that cannot be taxed. The research on post-traumatic growth shows that people who survive a fundamental disillusionment, the loss of a belief they built their life around, often emerge with a clarity that the unbroken never develop. They stop chasing approval. They stop measuring themselves against people who started richer. They stop confusing effort with progress. The system that tried to break them gave them something the system never intended: the ability to see through the illusion and keep moving anyway. You have that now. You earned it with every hour you worked that did not add up. You earned it with every time you believed the promise and watched it break. You earned it with every mortgage payment that felt like a weight rather than a step forward. The system did not intend for you to gain this knowledge, but you have it, and it is yours to use. The closing move is not to win. The closing move is to stop letting the system define what winning means. The wealth you will never accumulate is a story they wrote. The ladder you will never climb is a path they built. The success you will never achieve is a target they placed. You can stop aiming at their target and start asking what you would aim at if you had never been told what to want. That is the real inheritance the mechanism hides from you. Not money, not property, not tax advantages, but the right to define the purpose of your own existence without reference to a scoreboard that was rigged before you were born. And when you take that right, when you stop checking the metrics they gave you and start building the life you actually want to live, you become something the system cannot process. You become a person who cannot be controlled by the promise of advancement because you have stopped believing the promise was ever real. You become a person who cannot be intimidated by the threat of failure because you have stopped accepting their definition of success. You become a person who works not because you expect to rise, but because the work itself is meaningful, and the meaning is yours to assign. The machine depends on your belief that the game is legitimate. The moment you stop believing, the machine loses its power over you. Not by changing the system, not by overthrowing the wealthy, but by ceasing to be a source of energy that flows upward through the tax code and the housing market and the inheritance pipeline. You stop being fuel. You become a person instead. And that is the one thing the mechanism cannot account for. It can outspend you. It can outlast you. It can outmaneuver you. but it cannot outthink a person who has decided that the only game worth playing is the one they designed themselves. You already have the blueprint. Now go build something the machine never saw coming.